Thank you very much, Michael. Thank you, Paula, for hosting us. Thank you all for coming for what I hope will be a very lively discussion on broadband competition. We're following up three important speeches by Chairman Wheeler, FCC General Counsel Salad, and Assistant Attorney General or Antitrust Division Chief Baer, which made a number of policy pronouncements and kind of regulatory approaches and approaches to mergers. My comments are somewhat covering the same topic, but in a somewhat different way. They are more of a progress report since what's happened with the plan. They're also derived more from game theory and from lessons I learned in government, not just with the plan, but as Chief of Staff to the FCC in the '96 Act, as well as with working with certain broadband competition initiatives, specifically Gig.U and Republic Wireless. So there's some other things I've been working on that are also related to this. I should note that a version that's about twice as long as the remarks I'm going to give is up on the website so that I could kind of fill in what I will pass over very quickly here. But I'm going to start with my bottom line, which is that the highest priority for government broadband competition policy ought to be to lower input costs for adjacent market competition and network upgrades. Today I'll argue for that bottom line and illustrate by pointing to where policy has the opportunity to create a virtuous cycle of upgraded mobile stimulating low-end broadband upgrades, in turn causing an upgrade of higher-end broadband, which by using its assets to enter mobile can accelerate the need for mobile to upgrade, creating a virtuous cycle that I think would be in the country's interest. So here's how I get to that bottom line. I start with three questions. What do we want broadband competition to accomplish? Where does broadband competition come from? And given the current market, what are the appropriate government levers to intensify competition? As to the first, I would start by saying that the '96 Act sought competition in all communications markets, but most of the debate focused on producing a single outcome in the voice market, and that was lower prices. Broadband is very different. There are a number of variables we wish broadband to deliver. The two most prominently discussed are lower prices and improved performance, but there are others. Optimizing for multiple factors makes policy calls more complex. Different policies can deliver better outcomes as to some metrics and worse outcomes as to others, and that requires trade-offs. This makes, in my view, competition more important as our competition can optimize for multiple factors according to consumer preferences more adroitly than a policy process. Now, my own view of what we want competition to deliver is the elimination of bandwidth as a constraint to innovation, economic growth, and social progress. Further, I believe that goal is likely to be achieved only when there are at least two next-generation networks capable of delivering all foreseeable needs for the next decade at least, and with a viable upgrade path. With only one such network, economic forces will likely price the marginal use of bandwidth at a level that constrains growth and progress. Thus, we need multiple networks upgraded. In short, we want competition to help move us from today's world, which I think is where the dominant business model is how to allocate scarce bandwidth, to one where competition is over the best deployment of abundant bandwidth. Second, where does competition come from? There are two related answers. The first goes to the nature of competitive enterprises, and the second involves an economic equation, or at least as much of an equation as an American studies major like me can do. There are four kinds of enterprises capable of intensifying competition: existing players and new entrants, which come in three varieties: greenfield new entrants, adjacent market entrants who bring asymmetric assets and interests, and entrants who depend on input sold on a wholesale basis. But all four follow a similar economic pattern. First, intensified competition always requires a new capital allocation decision by one of those four kinds of enterprises. My guess is that my conservative friends are nodding, my progressive friends are a little bit nervous, but as a factual matter, we should all agree that intensified competition in communications has to follow a company shifting its capital allocation from one purpose to the purpose of providing or upgrading a communication service. A second pattern is that new capital allocation decisions follow a change in the same formula. So ask yourself, why don't we have more intense competition now? And the answer is a formula, which if we had the slides, I would be showing you. But it's simply, We can? Oh, how wonderful. Throw the formula. It's CapEx plus OpEx is greater than risk-adjusted revenues plus system benefits plus the threat of competitive losses. That is, the reason we don't have greater competition now is that the new or incremental capital and operating expenses of a network capable of intensifying competition are greater than those risk-adjusted new or incremental revenues, plus the benefits to the overall system, plus the risk of lost revenues to competition. So if we want to intensify competition, we have to change that math, causing, where possible, CapEx, OpEx, and risk to go down, revenue system benefits, and competitive threats to go up. And third, historically, the biggest changes in the competitive landscape in communications result from changes in which the formula, changes in the formula which themselves result directly from changes in government policy. Oh, do I get it back? Cool. That's interesting. I don't want anyone here to blame Microsoft. That would be bad. I'm sure it was something I did in the PowerPoint.
It's obviously Google because you use Google.
I don't think I think I won't tell you who I was using, but I'm not sure. Anyway, but that's basically the formula, and this is something we've talked a lot. This actually comes out a lot of the Google Fiber project and the Gig.U project. But I think if you look at all the big changes, they always follow government policies which affect the equation on at least one of those metrics and often on several. Cable intensified competition with broadcast following new pole attachment copyright rules. DBS and telcos intensified multi-channel video competition after rules granting non-discriminatory access to programming or the elimination of franchise monopolies. Wireless began competing with wireline when the government both created more competition with spectrum auction and, in the most underrated decision ever, lowered the terminating access price from wireless to wired. Cable began competing with telco when the program access rules that I mentioned forced it into a much more competitive situation in which they would lose to DBS if they didn't have another industry line. And of course, Google has decided to devote more capital to its fiber projects when cities expressed a willingness to reform construction-related and other regulations that fundamentally address 5 out of the 6 of those. And in turn, the telcos responded by doing what they had said previously they wouldn't do, going into fiber. And that's causing Comcast and the other cable folks to accelerate their deployment of 3.1, DOCSIS 3.1. So this demonstrates how policy affects capital allocation and competition. They also suggest not all 4 categories are equal in producing long-term competitive effects. Blair praised online video distribution as disruptive innovation. I certainly agree about the value of disruptive as opposed to traditional competition. Indeed, after some period of time, markets tend to stabilize, and it's difficult to affect the incentives of existing players without introducing a new competitor or technology substitute. For example, that decision on wireless to wired, terminating access, and a similar decision that allowed VoIP to essentially connect without terminating access charges is the reason why, whereas 20 years ago we were discussing extensively price per minute on long distance, no one has talked about price per minute with the one exception of prisons, which is actually kind of interesting. But anyway, I disagree with the nomenclature Blair used. I don't really see them as new entrants. Rather, they're adjacent market entrants. That is, they had assets and motives very different than the traditional players. And the last 20 years, I think, suggests the asymmetry of those assets and motives, if unleashed in an adjacent market, leads to far greater disruptions than existing competitors or new entrants in a mature market are likely to cause. And similarly, Google Fiber could be seen as a new entrant. People mostly characterize it that way. The truth is they had a lot of existing assets in terms of network assets to lower its cost structure. And they also had motive to improve search revenues and YouTube performance through better broadband performance. With Gig.U, I should note, we worked with some true new entrants or greenfield new entrants, and those efforts failed. And as we discussed in a handbook we published this summer, efforts involving greenfield new entrants have a much higher likelihood of failure for a variety of reasons. And so I think regulators should be cautious about making regulatory policy that bets on such entrants, and instead prioritize strategies that enable asymmetric adjacent market entry. Similarly, I'm concerned about unbundled strategies, which can absolutely work to reduce prices, but discourage investments in an upgrade or quality improvement. We can chat more about that, I'm sure. So in short, in answer to this question, if we want intensified competition to deliver abundant bandwidth, we should evaluate how government affects that equation today with particular attention to how it can incent adjacent market entry. Well, that leads to our third question, which do I have a clicker at all? Oh, okay. No, that's actually the least important. So now I'm going to go back to 2009, and what we saw there was we saw three broadband markets. You could characterize them as one that looked to us like three different ones. One is a high-speed wired broadband market, generally characterized by a single provider cable. A second, that's not true in Ohio's territories, but for about 75% of the country it was true. Oh, you do have those? Oh, no, don't worry about that. A low-speed wired market generally characterized by a single-player telco, and a mobile market generally characterized by at least 4 players. Some would argue it's a single market, and certainly there is some price impact. But I would just note that all the three government officials I noted saw high-end and low-end as separate markets. Some might also argue that wireless competes with wires. Bill Baer directly addressed that in noting that, quote, today wireless is too capacity constrained and costly to provide a meaningful alternative to consumers. Now, I'm not, Hal might have better answer than me in terms of an economist's answer to whether they should be seen as a single market or three separate ones. But I'm going to tell you how we kind of looked at it with the plan, and that brings us to the game theory. So when we looked at the data, we realized that for the first time since the beginning of the commercial internet, there was no national provider with plans to deploy a better network than the current best available network. So the data suggested, and experience actually confirmed, that the current market forces would not drive deployment of a world-leading wireline network in the United States. For 75%, as I noted, cable had both the fastest network and the cheapest upgrade path. So the future looked like a cable versus copper competition, which would be premised on allocating scarce bandwidth instead of building on technological advances to deploy abundant bandwidth. So in thinking about the movement from scarcity to abundance, we started thinking about the prisoner's dilemma. Classic game theory, you all probably know, prisoners are both better off if they don't talk, but that requires them to trust each other not to talk. The cop wants them to talk, but to do so must cause a defection. So if you substitute the idea of talking with investment, you ask yourself, do cable and telco trust each other not to invest in next generation networks? Because if they do, they're both economically better off by harvesting their existing past investments. But if society wants to remove bandwidth constraints on innovation, economic growth, and social progress, we have to cause a defection. And that brings us to what I think of as the core dynamic, intensifying competition between the three adjacent markets to drive each to invest in more abundant bandwidth. So our first thought was consistent with Baer's point, which was remove capacity constraints by providing the wireless sector with more spectrum. Not only is it good in and of itself, it negates the telco's harvest strategy and therefore changes the capital allocation decision for both wireless and the telco sectors, improving the economics of the upgrade, and by increasing competition, increasing the motive for the telcos to upgrade. Plan made many recommendations, a number of them actually were adopted, but there are two problems, or actually there are more, but I'll just talk about two problems with that as a strategy. First, it takes a long time. And second, the two largest wireless providers are also the two largest fixed line providers, and so the incentives are not quite as pure. And that doesn't mean you don't proceed, it just means you have to be realistic about the timing and the impact if that was your sole strategy to drive the upgrade. So then we looked at the second leverage point, which was improving the economics of a telco upgrade. We made a number of proposals at that time, but as it turns out, cities actually have greater leverage to improve the math. This has been made clear by not just the Google Fiber project, but also by the Gig.U project that I've been involved with. But the Google project, which came out of discussions of the plan, has been the principal driver of what we love to think of as the game of gigs. It's highly unlikely to cover the entire country, however, though I would note they just announced another 3, which is great. But Bernstein, the equity research firm, I think said at the end of 6 to 8 years, the most they will do, the most aggressive would be about 20 million homes, I think. It's in the written version. But as we discussed in the handbook we published this summer, a lot of other communities are doing a lot of other things. So it's not just Google. They all come down to the same basic strategies of asset utilization and improvement, regulatory flexibility to accommodate new business models and demand aggregation. And there's a lot of details in that book, but we shouldn't let the federal government off the hook. Indeed, there are a number of now legislative efforts, such as the Dig.U bill introduced by Representatives Walden and Eshoo, that's quite consistent, though I think it actually improves on the Dig.U recommendation in the plan. There was also a hearing this week, and it's interesting because it got a lot of bipartisan support for a number of things that the federal government should be doing to follow that better asset utilization and improving assets. I certainly agree with those things, and actually it's remarkable how many of them were kind of in the plan, and it raises an interesting question of why there wasn't such a hearing right after the plan was released, but I'll leave that for another time. Part of the answer, by the way, was the Comcast case came out, and the 8th floor at the commission could not focus on simultaneously implementing the plan and dealing with net neutrality. It was complicated. But in any event, I think based on the experiences I've had, pole attachments is a much bigger issue than even though we had 5 recommendations about it. It's an even bigger issue. And cities should be looking at accelerating competition by updating their as-builts within the poles. The federal government could also do something related to that. We're actually getting into a situation where lots of delays in construction are being caused by not just Google, but also AT&T and also some others wanting to upgrade at the same time. So we actually have a really interesting, it's a high-class problem of in certain areas too much upgrading, and that kind of delays everybody. So those are the first 2 levers, that they provide telcos 2 incentives to upgrade, better economics for deployment of upgraded networks, and the threat of new competition, and both put pressure on cable to upgrade. The third level actually stems, I kind of had a notion of it, but it didn't really realize it until the summer of 2011. I was talking with a friend, the CEO of a company named Bandwidth.com. My friend is David Morkin, who's the founder and the CEO. And he suggested that his company use their existing assets to launch a Wi-Fi based mobile service. I actually first thought he was crazy, but within a short period of time he converted me. And shortly thereafter the company launched Republic Wireless, which is today the largest Wi-Fi first mobile company. But ask yourself the following question, which was part of the reason I thought he was crazy, but he was right. How can a company with a couple hundred employees in North Carolina develop and deliver a product that the cable companies with far greater capital and far greater number of employees has not yet done? And the answer is motive. They had the means and the opportunity, they didn't have the motive. Why would Comcast attack a market that might cause a counterattack, reducing prices throughout all broadband markets? The logical path is not to attack, but rather to focus on harvesting existing networks until one is forced to attack. If, however, there are sufficient forces threatening cable's existing revenue streams, it will, as it did when DBS threatened their multi-channel video revenue stream, attack new markets. Alternatively, if enough players like Republic enter the space and wireless providers seek new revenue streams by aggressively pursuing cord cutting in the broadband market, cable will enter the mobile market because the game is already afoot. And indeed, with Verizon and AT&T ramping up competition in the video market and over-the-top threatening as well as folks like Republic and others entering the Wi-Fi space, you now see Comcast more aggressively pursuing its mobile strategy, and I suspect the other cable guys will follow. And this will in turn intensify competition in all 3 markets. So that third lever requires a couple of elements. Government must assure unlicensed continues to have sufficient spectrum and doesn't suffer degradation. And there has to be enough of competition within the mobile market to enable a wholesale market. So summarizing my answer to the 3 questions, if we understand that what we want is to remove bandwidth constraints to innovation, growth, and social progress, we want policy to create incentives for competitive upgrades. For policy to play that role, it must drive changes in capital allocation and the economics of deployment. To do that, policy should look to where it can lower input costs for all potential competitors, but particularly for adjacent market entrants. And here, policy should assure that all three submarkets have the means, motive, and opportunity to enter the adjacent market, as that will create the competitive virtuous cycle that drives toward bandwidth abundance. Let me just close with this. Last month, Jeff Greenfield in the New York Times sought to explain the explosion of great television this way. When technology replaced scarcity with abundance, every core assumption about TV began to crumble. Everything about the medium, how we receive it, how we consume it, how we pay for it, how we interact with it, has been altered, and TV is infinitely better for it. The purpose of broadband competition is to cause the same explosion of abundance with bandwidth, and I actually think we're much better off than we were 5 years ago. And I think we'll see that more clearly in a couple of years. But if we can stay focused on the key leverage point, we can create bandwidth abundance, and our country will also be infinitely better off for it. Thank you very much.